These next couple of pictures I hope will serve two purposes. Most importantly, I hope to get you motivated to get these wings built, because as you see in this picture, to get to this step right here goes really fast, and before you know it, this is where you will be. And second of all, I want to point out the table that I used to set my wings on. In the background there, which is kind of hard to see, there's a homemade plywood table that I made, and here's a better shot of it. On the left hand side there, it's a foldable table, and then of course on the right side there is a black toolbox. And I was fortunate enough that the two of them were close enough in height that I could make use of them. So this is the arrangement that I went with. People do all kinds of different things. I know some people actually make jigs to hold the spars, and some people actually build the wings vertically. But this is what I used. I just used a homemade foldable bench and a roll-around toolbox to build my wings on. Before I go into the process of installing the ribs onto the spars, I wanted to take a moment to talk about these two special ribs. The one on the top obviously is sheeted in plywood, and that particular rib will go on the center section end of the spars. The rib below it is a reinforced rib with the extra vertical pieces. That rib goes on the wingtip end of the spars. And then if I come over here, I want to show you this little piece of plywood here is also needed for your and I'll go into that a little bit more, but I just wanted to point them out. You're going to need these special pieces in specific locations on the spars, and I just wanted to point them out real quick, and as I said, I'll cover that some more here in a moment. Okay, the first thing you do then is get your spars up into position, and you can start sliding the ribs on one at a time. What I did is I worked from one end of the spars and I slid on half of the ribs, and then I went on to the other side and slid on the other half. Now you need to make note of the special ribs. I believe it's the 7th rib in from the tip. That's the rib that requires the smaller triangular piece of plywood. That rib marks the end of the aileron bay, and that will make more sense to you later on when you start building the wing. But if you don't currently have that piece of plywood in place, it can be put on any rib after the ribs are on, but I like to go ahead and incorporate mine when I was building the ribs themselves, so I had to make sure I got that rib in the right location. But just pay attention, make sure you get your end ribs on the ends, and you get the aileron type rib and the number 7 position, I believe it is, and just slide them on. And do what you need to do to get them on. If they're tight, if they're not sliding on, then of course you need to sand or do some more cutting to get them to slide. But just get them on there, and that. Believe it or not, probably the most important thing to do when you're building your wing is to keep the ends of the spars even. So what I came up with is what you see here. The two smaller pieces that make up the corner, those are oak pieces that I screwed in place from underneath, and those form a perfect 90-degree angle. Then I screwed to the one piece of oak the piece of knotty pine that you see here under the clamp, and that piece of pine acts as a fence so I can butt both spars up against it to keep them even. And then of course I go ahead and I clamp the spar in place to hold that one corner. and using the rib as a guide, if you will, because obviously the ribs dictate how far apart the spars are. I went ahead and butted the rear spar up against the fence and clamped it into place as well. Here you can just barely make out the clamp that's holding the rear spar up against the fence in the background on the right hand side of this picture. So in the foreground you have the 90-degree corner that I made out of the oak boards, and those are screwed in from underneath, as I said before. And the front spar I have set back from that front piece of oak about 6 or 7 inches. I set it back that far because I don't want the nose of the ribs to rub on anything. They need to float because you need to be able to slide those around. So knowing that the spar that is where it is clamped, that is 6 inches back from the forward piece of oak. To the left you see a stained piece of knotty pine. That is also cut to the same 6 inches, and that is clamped to that front oak piece, and then the spar is clamped to it. So that just maintains that 6-inch spacing. So on the right side of the picture I have the spar clamped, set back 6 inches from the end of the table, and then the stained piece of wood on the left maintains that same 6 inches, and then it is clamped as well. Now the ribs themselves, they dictate the spacing between the spars, obviously. So since the front spar is locked in place, the rear spar has nowhere to go once it's put in place with the ribs. Alright, and there it is. That's my finished wing. I am done and moving on to the fuselage. No, actually that is my center section, but I wanted to include this this picture to demonstrate that the 90-degree corner formed with those pieces of oak. I also used that same setup to keep square my center section when I was building it, which I'll cover in another DVD. But just keep in mind, if you use this method, you can also keep it in place and use it to square up your center section when you're building it. Now the plans do note locations for the ribs on the spars, but knowing that the ribs need to be moved some to clear some fittings, I did not use those locations. I just went ahead and slid my ribs on, and then using the holes that are drilled into the spars for the metal fittings, I ran string from hole to hole, as you can see here in this picture, the string anyway. I just ran it from one fitting hole to the other fitting hole, simulating the drag cables, and then moved my ribs accordingly to clear the string, basically ensuring that when I do the cables, after everything is epoxied in place, the cables will clear the ribs and I'll have no issues. Once you have verified that you have your ribs at the proper location on the spars, meaning that you have your end ribs on the end and you have your special aileron rib, if you already have the plywood on it, where it needs to be for the aileron, and you also have verified that the drag cables will clear all the ribs using the string, go ahead and make a pencil mark at each rib location on the spar right next to the vertical piece that the spar attaches to. Now in this picture I made my mark and then I moved the rib over so you can see the mark, and then you'll notice what looks like a little arrow. That little arrow is just a note to myself so that when I come back to put the epoxy on, I know which side of that line the rib needs to be. So in this particular picture, the rib will be slid from where it is over to the left on the line. I know that the line is there and the rib is actually to the right of that line as indicated by the arrow. Now you need only mark a little tick mark for each rib location. You do not need to draw a solid line as you see here. Then, after you get all of your tick marks on one spar, do not mark them on both spars. Go ahead and pick one or the other. I recommend the front spar. Make all your little tick marks next to each rib on that spar, and then remove all of the ribs. Completely slide all the ribs completely off of the spar. Because what you want to do now is lay that spar down, get out your square, and at each tick mark draw a solid line that will be absolutely perpendicular to the spar. That's what's represented in this picture. That solid line is my squared up line that I drew using a square, knowing that now it is perpendicular to the rest of the spar. Do that at each tick location on one spar. Once you get all the lines drawn, you take your other spar, bring it up against this spar, make sure the ends are perfectly even, and transfer those lines. I can talk, can't I? Transfer those lines from one spar onto the other, making sure that the ends are perfectly even. Now you have rib locations on both spars that are exactly in alignment with each other, and I highly recommend doing the little arrow notation so you know which side of that line the ribs need to be, because that's going to play a key in putting the epoxy on as well. And you need to make sure that you have your rib on the same side of the line on both spars. You don't want one rib to the right of the line on the front spar and that same rib to the left of the line on the rear spar. Obviously they'd be crooked. So go to each tick mark, make a nice solid line using a square to get them perfectly perpendicular. Lay one spar up against the other spar flat on the floor or on your workbench, and then transfer the line from one spar to the other, and then go ahead and draw those solid lines square using a square. How's that? And one last note on drawing lines. Make sure that when you draw your lines, you draw them on the correct side of the spar. By that I mean you want to have your lines drawn on the side of the spar where the vertical piece of the rib is going to be. I made the mistake of drawing all my lines on the wrong side of the spar. I slid all my ribs into place, and then when I went to align the ribs, I had no pencil marks. They were all on the opposite side of the spar, which did me absolutely no good. I had to strip them all off, lay the spar back down, redraw the lines on the proper side, and then try to reassemble it. So just make sure again you have your spars oriented front spar, rear spar. You have them right side up using the notch, and draw your lines on the proper side of the spar so when you put your ribs back on you can actually use them. While you are trial fitting your ribs onto the spars and you're getting your rib locations marked and you're getting the string ran to make sure that the ribs will clear the drag cables, another thing to keep in mind is you may have to cut out some clearance areas on the ribs where the metal fittings are going to go. I had made my slits as you see here pretty much the exact width as the spars. However, when I add my straps and my metal fittings into place, they don't clear. There's no room for them. So I had to go back and cut these angled notches onto my ribs. And then obviously, since I've removed a lot of material from the rib cap strips, I went ahead and added an additional cap strip behind these areas as a reinforcement, as you see here in this picture. So I actually had my metal fittings in hand, so I went ahead and temporarily put them on the spars and then made my clearance cuts on the ribs to fit. But again, you could also just make some kind of a paper or cardboard template to represent the metal fitting and use those to cut your clearance areas. Whatever works for you. Whatever's easiest. So now you go ahead and you can slide all your ribs back onto the spars. Now you may be wondering why I had you put the ribs on the spars and make sure they were in the proper locations as far as the reinforced rib on the tip end, the plywooded rib on the center section end, and then make sure that you have the aileron rib at the number 7 position, just to strip it all off again. Well, the reason I do that is because when you take the time to have your ribs in position correctly, you get a mental picture of what that looks like. So if you come back after stripping the ribs off and you put them back on the second time around after making your line marks and making sure that the notches are cut to clear the fittings, you'll know right away if something doesn't look right. If a rib is in the wrong place, it will kind of jump out at you because you know what it looks like when it's correct. So it's just a little way to kind of check and balance to make sure you get everything back on correctly. If everything looks good, it probably is good, but just double check and make sure that they're on the proper locations, and your drag cables will clear, your notches are cut. Just check and recheck everything, make sure it all makes sense, because we are going to start epoxying. We are actually going to start final assembly on this wing. Now that you have the spars and the ribs back up on the table and back together again in their proper positions, you want to go ahead obviously and pull the spars back up against the fence and clamp them down so that they're even on the ends. And then if you did the spacer block deal like I did, you want to measure from that front strip of oak, as you see here, measure back your 6 or 7 inches. And then further down the spar, as you see in this picture, you put your block at 6, 7 inches, whatever you decide, and clamp everything together so that front spar is butted up against the fence and it's spaced evenly from the front of the table to the spar at that 6 or 7 inches. And then you have your ribs in place, which dictate the spacing between the spars, and you have your rear spar up against the fence and clamped as well, sort of like you see in this picture. So once you have that all done, your ribs should be free to slide, and you can go ahead and start putting on your epoxy. Now going back to this photo here, you noticed a little arrow. As I said, that's just a reminder so I know what side of the line the rib needs to be. You go ahead and put your epoxy from the top of the spar to the bottom of the spar along that line on the right hand side, and then you would just slide the rib over to the line and basically slide it over the epoxy, if you will. Now if you have enough space on your ribs, you'll be able to pull that spar back, and when you slide the ribs, you'll be able to clear the epoxy, and you get the rib in place on the line, and then release the spar, and then it will make contact to the epoxy and smush it, if you will, against the vertical piece on the rib. But I made my clearances fairly snug, so I couldn't pull the spar away from the rib to clear the epoxy, so mine kind of slid over it. But anywho, you put the epoxy on and slide the rib over, align the rib with the line, and then you can clamp it in place. Now, a little tidbit, you know, you're messing with these spars that are relatively thin, you know, 1 inch, 3/4 of an inch thick, and quite long, so they may develop a little twist from one end to the other, kind of like a twist drill. So as you see in this picture, you can barely make out the bar clamps that I used, and I would squeeze the spar ever so slightly. I'd squeeze the spars together so that it would compress the spars into the vertical pieces on the ribs where the epoxy was. And I did this 3 ribs at a time, mostly because that's all the epoxy that I wanted to mix up at a given time and make sure that I used it before it got too firm and too set, and also because I was limited on my bar clamps. But doing it a little at a time, I worked from the fence end of my table where the clamps were and worked my way all the way to the tip end of the wing, 3 ribs at a time. And what that will do, that will in effect walk out any twist that you may develop in the spars. So again, if you start at the fence end and epoxy 3-4 ribs at a time, If there's any kind of variance on the spars, twisting wise, you can kind of take that out with the clamps. You don't want to clamp too tight because you don't want to snap a rib or put undue stress on it when the epoxy sets, and then when you release the clamps, who knows over time what will happen with that stress. But that's how I did it. And I know a lot of people build the jigs and they put all their ribs on at one time, but I did mine a little at a time, just so I can keep up with things and monitor how things are progressing and how the spars are acting and whatnot. So just get them on there, make sure they're lined up with the line nice and perpendicular and everything straight, square, and go to town on it. And just in case you haven't seen this picture the other 500 times that I've had it in this DVD, here is what you should end up having when you're done epoxying your ribs. And lastly, for the ribs, I believe, well, at least for now anyway, are these little filler blocks. My spars, as I said, they were 5 inches, I think, and I used the riblet 612 rib, so I had a pretty good sized space between the top of the spar and the bottom of the top cap strip on the rib. So I went ahead and filled in that gap with these blocks. No big deal. It goes pretty quick. So next we will move on to the aileron bay. Hey everybody, just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I wanted to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.